The moment the auctioneer yanked the burlap sack from Anna Beckett's shoulders and left her standing on that sun-scorched wooden platform in nothing but her threadbare cotton dress, every man in Caldwell, Kansas went dead quiet, and it was that silence worse than any cat call or whistle that made her feel like the most alone creature God had ever set upon the earth. It was the summer of 1879, and the town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, a dusty, sun-hammered place where cattle drives rolled through like thunderstorms and men outnumbered women 4-1. The streets smelled of horses and leather, and the particular kind of desperate ambition that gathered at the edge of civilization, where the law was still finding its footing, and a man's word counted more than any printed deed. Anna had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks prior on the back of a supply wagon from Wichita, carrying nothing but a carpetbag with 2 dresses, a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a handwritten letter from a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had promised her steady work as a seamstress in his wife's dress shop. When she arrived, she learned that Gerald Forsyth had no wife, that the dress shop was a single room above a saloon, and that the work he had in mind for her was not the kind done with needle and thread. She had refused, and Gerald Forsyth, a man with a wide pink face and small bitter eyes, had done what petty men did when refused. He had spoken to Sheriff Dawes, a compact man who wore his tin star the way some men wore their sins out in the open, unapologetically. And 2 days later Anna had found herself standing before the town council charged with vagrancy and having no lawful means of support. The solution offered to her, as if it were a kindness, was the bride auction. Caldwell held them twice a year, a practice that the territory had not yet seen fit to outlaw, and the town justified it to itself with the logic of the frontier. Women needed protection, men needed wives, and the transaction simply made visible what was otherwise messy and slow. The women who stood on that platform were not always willing, though the posters printed on the bulletin boards outside the general store used words like opportunity and arrangement and future security. Anna Beckett was 22 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned at the nape of her neck, green eyes that shifted color depending on what she was feeling, brighter when she was angry, almost gray when she was frightened, and hands that were roughened from years of work but still graceful, the hands of someone who had learned to make do and still find something beautiful in the doing. She was not soft and she was not broken, though Caldwell was working hard on both. When the auctioneer, a reedy man named Holt with a reddened nose and an enthusiastic hammer, pulled the burlap away and left her standing in the afternoon light, she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin and looked out at the crowd with those shifting green eyes that were, in that moment, very nearly gray. The crowd was substantial. Cattle drovers, farmers, shop owners, men who had come to Caldwell with money enough to bid and the appetite to acquire. They stood in a rough semicircle around the platform, most of them in trail-worn clothes, some in their Sunday best, all of them looking at Anna Beckett the way men looked at livestock they were considering purchasing. That was when the sun came out from behind the clouds that had been building all morning over the Kansas plain, and the light hit the platform like a spotlight, and Anna felt the heat of it across her bare shoulders and arms, and she realized with a sick clarity that the dress she wore, the better of her two, a pale blue cotton thing she had mended herself 3 times, was thin enough in the afternoon glare that it was nearly transparent. She heard the low, rippling sound of appreciation move through the crowd like wind across wheat, and the gray in her eyes deepened and her jaw set hard, and she stared at some fixed point above the crowd and refused to let herself blink. Holt the auctioneer was warming up, working the crowd the way he worked every auction, whether he was selling a sorrel mare or a bolt of calico or a human being. He was talking about youth and good health and capable hands and the various domestic virtues that could be assumed, and Anna listened to none of it because listening to it would have destroyed her. She was aware of the men in the crowd shifting, some of them stepping forward, and she caught the particular quality of Gerald Forsythe's attention on her from the left side of the platform, that small-eyed watchfulness that told her he was here to see his scheme completed, and she felt the first real crack in her composure begin to work its way across her chest like a fault line. She would not cry. She had made that decision standing in the holding room behind the assay office before they brought her out. She would not give Caldwell that. She had given it 3 weeks of her labor and her dignity and her patience, and it would not have her tears as well. It was at precisely this moment, as Holt called for opening bids and a few voices began throwing numbers into the air with the casual pleasure of men who can afford to waste money, that she became aware of movement at the back of the crowd. A man was pushing through, not aggressively but steadily, with the unhurried purpose of someone who knew where he was going and was not interested in explaining himself to anyone he had to pass on the way. He was tall, not the biggest man in the crowd, but built the way good working horses were built, with a kind of useful, functional strength that had nothing to prove. He wore a dark canvas duster that had seen considerable mileage, trail-dusted boots, and a wide-brimmed hat the color of old tobacco. He had a jaw that looked like it had been decided upon firmly, dark brown eyes under equally dark brows, and a mouth that was currently set in a line that told the crowd without a word to move. He was, Anna would learn later, 28 years old. His name was Micah Walden. He ran cattle on a quarter section of land, 12 miles south of Caldwell near a creek called Blue Water, and he had come to town today for feed, not for this. He had walked past the platform entirely by accident, on his way from the feed merchant to the hardware store, and had stopped when he saw the crowd and pushed forward enough to see what held their attention. And now he stood at the edge of the platform and looked up at Anna Beckett standing in that thin blue dress with the Kansas sun pouring through her like she was made of window glass, and his jaw, if possible, set even harder. The bids were rising. $3, $5, $7.50. The men calling them out had the relaxed, proprietary confidence of people who believed that what was happening on that platform was orderly and therefore correct. Micah Walden watched Anna Beckett's face. He watched the way she was holding herself, that rigid, careful dignity, the way her hands were balled slightly at her sides where she probably thought no one could see. He watched the gray in her eyes even from that distance, though he could not have explained how he perceived the color of a woman's eyes from 20 feet away. He watched the way she did not look at the crowd, choosing instead that fixed point in the middle distance, and he recognized that kind of endurance. He had seen it in men after long, hard winters and brutal cattle seasons. He had worn it himself once or twice. He unbuttoned his coat. It was a long canvas duster, the inside lined with soft, worn flannel, and he stripped it off his shoulders in one motion and stepped up onto the platform without asking anyone's permission and walked across the weathered boards to where Anna Beckett stood, and he settled the coat around her shoulders. The crowd went entirely silent. Anna turned her head and looked at him, and her eyes were wide and startled, the green coming back into them because she was no longer frightened. She was surprised, which was a different thing entirely. The coat was enormous on her, the hem nearly dragging the boards, and it smelled of cedar and horses and something warmer underneath. And it was like being wrapped in a small, private world that had nothing to do with this crowd or this town or this terrible afternoon. Micah Walden turned to face the crowd and he looked at Holt the auctioneer with the particular expression of a man who is done waiting to be acknowledged and said, in a voice that carried to the back of the crowd without any apparent effort, "I'll take it from here. What's the current bid?" Holt, who was not a brave man, told him. $10, Micah Walden said, and the way he said it left absolutely no room for negotiation. Gerald Forsythe's pink face went a spectacular shade of red. He called out 12. Micah looked at him for a moment. 15, he said. Forsythe said 20, but his voice had lost its casual certainty and had picked up a querulous edge that told everyone listening that he was bidding from spite now, not desire. Micah said 25 and did not look at Forsyth when he said it. He looked at Anna. She looked back at him, and her chin was still up, but something had shifted behind her eyes, some infinitesimal relaxation of the terrible tension she had been holding since they brought her out of that holding room. Forsyth made a sound that was almost a word and then didn't say one. Nobody else bid. The hammer came down. Holt announced the name Micah Walden with the uncertain tone of a man who isn't entirely sure how the day went wrong but feels certain it did. The crowd dispersed slowly, some men grumbling, some just drifting back toward the saloons and their ordinary business. Micah stepped down from the platform and waited at the bottom of the 3 steps, not reaching up to help because he had the instinct to understand that Anna Beckett would come down on her own power. "Thank you." She did, holding his coat closed at the front with both hands, and she stood on the ground in front of him in the afternoon sun and looked up at him. She came to his chin, and she said with a kind of fierce, complicated dignity that nearly broke something open in his chest, "I am not a horse." "No," he said, "you are not. I don't know what you expect for $25, she said. "But I will tell you plainly that I have nothing to offer a man I don't know and don't choose, and that will not change, regardless of what that auctioneer's hammer says." Micah Walden looked at her for a long moment. He had a way of listening with his whole face, a stillness about him that was not emptiness but attention, as if whatever she said was worth taking the time to actually hear. "I don't expect anything," he said. "The only thing I'd ask is that you give me 10 minutes to explain my situation, and then you can decide entirely for yourself what to do next." 10 minutes, she said. It was neither a question nor an agreement. It was an evaluation. "We can stand right here in the street if you like," he said, "in plain sight of the whole town." She looked around at the street, then back at him. "The hotel has a parlor," she said. "I imagine that's public enough." They walked side by side to the Caldwell Hotel, which was a 2-story frame building that smelled of wood polish and old meals, and they sat in the parlor in 2 straight-back chairs near the window where Mrs. Cutter, the proprietress, could observe them from her desk, and Micah Walden explained himself. He had the Bluewater Quarter section, he said. 160 acres, good grass, a creek that ran clear most of the year. He ran beef cattle and had a contract with a packing house in Wichita that he needed to fulfill each autumn. He had a house genuinely, an actual house, not a soddy, though it was plain with 4 rooms and a solid roof. He had been alone on that land for 3 years since his hired man Eli had gone back to Missouri to tend his ailing father. He managed, but the ranch needed more hands than he had, and there were things that a single man couldn't do as efficiently as 2 people working together. He was not, he said carefully, looking for a servant. He was looking for a partner. He had not come to town today intending to bid in any auction. He said this plainly, without embarrassment. He had come to town for 50 pounds of oats. What he'd seen on that platform had changed his plans for the day. He did not say anything poetic about this. He did not dress it up. He simply said that what he'd seen was wrong and he was in a position to do something about it. So he had. And now he was having this conversation, and he would leave the rest entirely up to her. Anna listened to all of this without interrupting. She had very good instincts, sharpened by a childhood that had not been easy. Her father had drunk himself to death when she was 14. Her mother had followed 2 years later from consumption, and Anna had been her own person since she was 16, working as a seamstress and a laundress and once, for 3 months, as a cook's assistant in a boarding house in Abilene. She knew men who said one thing and meant another. She knew men who performed kindness like a stage magician performed a trick, all misdirection and concealed mechanism. Micah Walden did not have that quality. He sat in his straight-back chair with his hat on his knee and spoke in a straightforward, unhurried way, and he looked at her face while he was talking, not at her dress or her figure, and he did not soften anything he said or roughen it either. He just said it. "If I agree," she said when he had finished, "I want it clear that I am coming as myself with my own mind and my own opinions, and if something needs saying, I'll say it. I'd expect nothing less, he said. And I'll need to send a letter to my cousin in Abilene to let her know where I am. The post rider comes through twice a week, he said. And I want to know, she said, why you put your coat on me before you bid, because most men in your position would have simply bid. He was quiet for a moment, not thinking about what to say so much as finding the accurate way to say what he already thought. Because you deserved a coat, he said, before you deserved a bid. Anna Beckett looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she stood up and held out his coat and said, "You'll want this back. It's too warm for June." He took it and stood, and the corner of his mouth shifted barely in something that wasn't quite a smile but was close enough. "There's one thing I should tell you." "What's that?" "I only have one horse today. You'll ride behind me." She put her chin up again, that characteristic gesture he was already beginning to recognize. "I've ridden pillion before," she said. "It's not dignified, but neither is anything else that's happened to me today." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the last honest laugh he'd had in a long while, and it surprised him when it came out. They left Caldwell in the late afternoon, Anna sitting behind him on a sorrel gelding named Chester that she would learn was as steady as the man riding him, with her carpetbag tied to the saddle horn and her carpetbag's contents, the 2 dresses and the Bible, and a small folded piece of paper with her cousin Martha's address, which was everything she owned in the world. The Kansas prairie opened out around them, broad and golden in the evening light, the grasses running in long waves from the wind that came down from the north, and the sky above them was the particular deep blue of a clear July evening, holding just the first suggestion of stars at its zenith. Neither of them spoke much on the ride, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. There is a particular quality to the silence between 2 people who are both paying attention, who are both present to the same landscape at the same moment, and Anna noticed it without knowing quite what to make of it. She noticed also that he rode carefully on the rougher ground, slowing without being asked, and that when Chester shied at a jackrabbit that burst from the grass at the trail's edge, Micah steadied the horse with one quiet hand and said nothing dramatic about it. The Bluewater Ranch came into view as the last light was leaving the sky. It was modest and it was plain and it was exactly as advertised. The house was frame construction, weathered but solid, with a front porch running the width of the building. Behind it, a barn that was larger than the house, which told her something about Micah Walden's priorities. A corral with 3 horses in it, a kitchen garden that was functional if not flourishing, a root cellar with a heavy door, and a windmill that was turning slowly in the evening breeze. He helped her down from the horse, and she noticed he let go the moment her feet were on the ground. He showed her the house. The 4 rooms, a front room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms. He showed her the bedroom that would be hers, and it had a door with a latch and a window that faced east, and there was a quilt on the rope bed that was faded but clean, and she looked at it all with those evaluating green eyes and said, "It'll do." "I'll start supper," he said. She turned around. "You cook." "After a fashion. I haven't poisoned myself yet." "Go tend your horse," she said. "I'll cook." He opened his mouth and then closed it and went to tend Chester. And Anna Beckett walked into the kitchen of the Bluewater Ranch and found flour and salt pork and dried beans and a sack of cornmeal. And she made a cornbread and a pot of beans with salt pork and onion. And when Micah came back from the barn, the kitchen smelled like something close to civilization. And he sat down at the table and ate across from her without saying much. But the quality of his silence had changed again, deepened into something that was not mere appetite but appreciation. "It's good," he said. "It's beans," she said. "Don't be grateful until I've had access to proper supplies." He looked across the table at her and said, "What did you used to cook before?" She told him about the boarding house in Abilene, about her mother's kitchen before that, about the particular way her mother had made bread, kneading it with the heel of her hand in long, deliberate pushes, singing something low and formless under her breath. She hadn't meant to tell him that last part, but it came out anyway, and he listened without filling the pause, which was the right thing to do. When the meal was done and the dishes washed, she stood at the kitchen door and looked out at the dark prairie with the stars blazing overhead. The stars in Kansas in 1879 had nothing between them and the eye except clear air and distance, and they were extraordinary, and she said, "Thank you for today." "You don't owe me thanks," he said from the table where he was cleaning his boots. "I know I don't," she said. "I'm offering it anyway." He looked up. The lamp on the table made the light warm and particular, and his face in that light was different from his face in the afternoon sun, less guarded somehow, more itself. "You're welcome," he said, and looked back down at his boots. She went to bed in the east-facing room with the quilt and the latched door and lay in the dark listening to the windmill turn and the horses in the corral and the enormous breathing silence of the prairie. And she thought that she had been in worse situations, though she could not at that exact moment recall a specific one. She also thought, before she slept, about a man sitting at a kitchen table in the lamplight, and how entirely unexpected kindness still was, no matter how many times she failed to expect it. The first weeks at Blue Water were the work of two people learning to share a space without collision. Anna established herself in the kitchen. This was not merely preference but practical efficiency, since she could cook in half the time it took Micah and with far better results, and in the kitchen garden, which she found to be in a state of earnest neglect. There were tomatoes that needed staking, squash that needed thinning, and a row of beans that had been overtaken by a particularly determined variety of grass. Micah worked the cattle and the fence lines, and did not offer opinions about her management of the kitchen garden, which she appreciated. He did occasionally appear at the garden gate with a coil of rope or a fence post or some other item that happened to be useful, set it down without fanfare, and disappear back toward the barn. She watched him work. She was not romantic about it. She watched him the way she watched everything, with the steady attention of someone who needed to understand the world they were moving through. She saw that he was methodical and unhurried, that he planned ahead without announcing his plans, that he had a particular relationship with his animals that was respectful without being sentimental. He spoke to the horses and the cattle the way some men spoke to machines, with a quiet, instructional directness, and the animals responded the way well-tended machines respond, reliably. He watched her too, though he was less obvious about it. On the 11th day, there was a thunderstorm that came up in the afternoon with the suddenness of all Kansas weather, and Anna was in the garden when the sky went green and the wind came, and the first fat drops of rain fell like small stones. She ran for the porch and arrived there at the same moment as Micah, coming from the barn at a run, and they stood together on the narrow porch watching the storm come across the prairie in a great dark curtain. The lightning was spectacular. It came down in long white bolts across the flat land, and the thunder followed in rolling waves, and the rain was absolute, a solid wall of water that turned the yard to mud in minutes. "I love storms," Anna said. She said it without thinking, the way you say true things when you're not guarding yourself. Micah looked at her profile, lit by the lightning. "Most people are afraid of them out here," he said. "I know," she said. "I've never been most people." They stood there watching the storm for a long time, close together on the narrow porch, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm near hers, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them moved closer, and both of them were aware of both of those facts. That evening after supper she taught herself the particular layout of his bookshelves. He had more books than she had expected, a man who ran cattle on the Kansas prairie, and they were red books, not decorative ones, with cracked spines and margin notes in a small, deliberate hand. She took down a volume of Shakespeare's complete works and sat in the front room by the lamp, and after a while she heard his chair scrape and he came and sat across from her with his own book, and they read in comfortable silence for 2 hours, and Anna Beckett thought that this was, of all the things she had experienced in her life, among the most unexpectedly pleasant. She began to learn his rhythms. He woke before dawn every day and was in the barn by the time the sky began to lighten. He drank coffee so strong it could have stripped paint and ate whatever was put in front of him with equal appreciation. He did not waste words on things that didn't need words. He had a dry, understated humor that emerged at unpredictable moments. A single sentence that flipped a situation sideways and left her suppressing a laugh at the wrong time. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Missouri, that his parents had both died of typhoid when he was 23, that he had worked 2 cattle drives before deciding he'd rather own land than tend someone else's. He had bought the Bluewater parcel with every dollar he had and had been building it up since, and he was not rich but he was solvent, and there was a difference. He learned that she had an opinion about everything and expressed it when asked and sometimes when not asked. He learned that she could read a fence line or a sky as well as a page, that she was quick at arithmetic and kept meticulous accounts of the kitchen stores, that she cried once, quietly in the kitchen when she thought he was in the barn, and he'd been at the back of the house mending a window shutter and had heard her and gone back out through the yard, and came around the front and gave her half an hour before he came in through the front door with excessive noise about hanging his hat, and she was herself by then. Straight-backed and clear-eyed, and he never mentioned it. He told her later, much later, that it was that day he understood she was not fragile, that the crying was not fragility but humanity, and the recovering was not performance but character. But that came much later. What came first was a Tuesday in August when the packing house sent a rider with a problem. The rider was a young man named Pete Caswell, barely 19, dust-coated from a hard ride, and the news he carried was that the Wichita packing house had revised its September delivery requirements upward, 60 head instead of 40, and Micah's current count was 42. He'd need 18 head from somewhere in 6 weeks, and the nearest man with surplus cattle was a rancher named Boone Aldrich, who ran the AA spread 20 miles west. Micah sat at the kitchen table with the rider's letter and the look on his face that Anna had come to recognize as his problem-solving face, which looked from the outside almost exactly like no expression at all. "Can you get cattle from Aldrich?" Anna asked. "Aldrich is reasonable," Micah said. "The problem is cash. I've put most of the liquid money into the south fence repairs. What do you need?" "Another $200 to make the purchase worthwhile. I'll recoup it when the herd goes to Wichita, but I need it up front." Anna was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the bedroom and came back with the Bible, and she opened it to the back cover and unpinned something from inside the lining. It was a small cotton pouch, and she set it on the table without ceremony. Micah looked at the pouch and then at her. "It's $230, she said. "I've been carrying it since Abilene. I sewed it into the lining of the Bible because it was the one thing nobody would rob without feeling bad about it." "Anna," he said. His voice had an odd quality, like something had shifted somewhere inside him. "I can't take your money." "It's a loan," she said. "I'm not giving it to you, I'm lending it. You'll pay it back when the herd goes to Wichita." He looked at the pouch for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "Why trust me with this?" She looked at him steadily. "Because you put your coat on me before you bid," she said. "That tells me something about how a man treats a thing that's been put in his care." He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be significant, and then he reached out and took the pouch, and his hand briefly touched hers in the taking, and neither of them commented on this, but neither of them forgot it either. The trip to the AA was 2 days each way, and Micah asked Anna if she would be all right alone at Bluewater. "I'm armed," she said, "and I know how to cook. I'll be fine." He showed her where he kept the rifle as if she hadn't already found it the first week. He showed her how to latch the barn from the inside. He left the fastest horse in the corral. He was thorough and practical about it, and he was also, she noticed, slightly reluctant, which he handled by being more thorough and practical. "Micah," she said when he had checked the water supply and the lantern oil for the second time. "Yes." "Go," he went. The 2 days he was gone were the first time she had been truly alone at Bluewater, and she used the time to do a thorough inventory of the house, which she had been wanting to do but hadn't felt it was her place yet. She found the expected things: tools, spare rope, a tin of nails, And she also found, in a crate under Micah's bed, a small collection of items that gave her pause. A woman's handkerchief, embroidered with the initials CL, a tintype of a young woman with light hair. A ribbon, faded to the color of old rosewood. She put everything back exactly as she found it, and she thought about what she'd seen with the careful, non-sentimental attention she gave to all problems, and she concluded that Micah Walden had been in love before and it had not gone well, and that this explained certain qualities of his reserve. She did not pry, and she did not ask. He returned on the fourth day, ahead of schedule, with 18 head of cattle and a slightly more relaxed expression than he'd left with. The cattle deal with Boone Aldrich had gone smoothly. He also brought, tied behind his saddle, a paper-wrapped package from the general store in the town near the AA. He set it on the kitchen table without explaining it and went to put Chester up. Anna opened it. It was a bolt of green cotton fabric, the color of spring grass, and a card of brass buttons, and a spool of good thread. She was holding the fabric when he came in from the barn, and she looked at him with the particular, unguarded expression she hadn't yet learned to suppress entirely, which was too open and too much, and she felt the color come up in her face and looked back down at the fabric. "You said you were a seamstress," he said, hanging his hat. "I thought you might want materials." "The green is," she started and stopped. "What?" She looked up. "It's the right color," she said. "That's all." He looked at her for a moment, and the corner of his mouth did the thing that wasn't quite a smile but was more than almost, and he said, "Good," and went to wash up. September came, and the cattle drive to Wichita was a necessary 3-day absence. And this time Micah hired 2 of the Caldwell boys, Pete and his older brother Dan, to help with the drive, and he left at first light with the herd moving and Anna standing on the porch in the early chill watching until the dust settled back down on the trail. She felt his absence as a presence, which was its own kind of revelation. While he was gone, she finished the green dress and wore it the morning he came back, and she was in the kitchen garden when she heard Chester's hoofbeats on the trail and straightened up in the row of carrots she'd been tending. And when he rode into the yard and swung down and saw her standing in the garden in the green dress with the morning light on her, and her hair coming loose from its pins from the work of the morning, he stopped moving for a moment the way a man stops when something requires the full processing power of his attention. "You made it," he said, meaning the dress. "With your buttons," she said, and held out the carrot she'd just pulled. "And here, from your garden." The carrot. He was looking at her face, not the dress. He said, "Everything go all right while I was gone. The Hadley boy came by selling eggs," she said. "I bought 2 dozen. The windmill needed oiling. I figured out how to do it from looking at the mechanism, and I found a nest of barn swallows in the loft." "The oiling," he said. "How did you reach it?" "The ladder." "Anna," he said, with a quality in his voice that was not quite exasperation but was its neighbor. "I didn't fall," she said. "Obviously." He looked at her for another long moment. "Obviously," he said, he'd been paid for the herd. He gave her back her $230 with $20 interest on top, precise to the cent. She protested the interest. He said a loan was a loan. They argued about it for 3 minutes, which was the first real argument they'd had, and she enjoyed it because he argued fairly, which was not a universal male quality in her experience, and she conceded the interest with the distinct impression that she'd made her point anyway. He paid off the remaining fence repairs and put money against the spring stock purchase, and came back from town one afternoon in October with a receipt from the Caldwell bank and a small wrapped parcel that he set on the table. She unwrapped it. It was a pen and ink set, a good one, with 3 nibs and a glass bottle of black ink and a leather case to hold it all. "I noticed," he said, sitting down, "that you're left-handed and you've been making do with that awful stub pencil for your accounts." She looked at the pen set. Then she looked at him. "Micah," she said. "Yes. I need you to understand something." He waited, attentive. "I am not a woman who falls easily," she said. "I want you to know that because I've been watching you for 4 months, and you are making it very difficult to hold to that." The room was very quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked, Outside, the wind moved across the grass. Micah Walden set his elbows on the table and leaned forward and looked at her with the full, complete attention he had given her since the afternoon on that platform in June, and he said, "I have something to say too." "All right," she said. "I came to town that day for oats," he said. "And I saw you up on that platform, and I couldn't tell you then, and I couldn't tell you after for a lot of reasons, but I'm telling you now." He paused, organizing the words. "I didn't put the coat on you because I was going to bid. I put the coat on you because you were standing there like you were trying to hold yourself together with sheer stubbornness. And that dress wasn't," he stopped, searched for the word that was honest without being coarse. "The situation wasn't decent. You deserved better than what they were doing to you. I know that's why you did it," she said softly. "But somewhere in between doing it and getting down off that platform," he said, "I understood that I wasn't going to leave you there. Not with Forsyth bidding. Not with any of them bidding." He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. "I told myself it was practical, that I needed someone at Blue Water. Both things are true, but they're not the whole of it." "What's the whole of it?" she asked, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were all green now, bright green, the color they went when she felt something strongly. "The whole of it," he said, "is that you said thank you for the coat, and then you told me you weren't a horse, and I thought this is a remarkable person, and I would very much like to know who she is." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been trying to write a letter to my cousin Martha." "I know," he said. "I've seen you starting it 3 times. I don't know what to say to her about the situation," Anna said, "because the situation is unclear. And I am a clear person. I don't like things to be unclear." "Then let me be clear," Micah said, and he reached across the table and put his hand over hers very carefully, the way you place a thing you want to keep safe. "I would like to court you, properly. I know that's different from what we've been doing, which is living and working together and calling it practical, but I'd like to do it the right way if you're willing." Anna looked at his hand over hers. Then she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his and said, "I think the right way probably started with a coat on a platform in June." He looked at their joined hands and then at her face, and the corner of his mouth did not do the almost smile thing. This time it was a full smile, slow and warm and complete, and it rearranged his whole face into something she had not quite seen before and immediately wanted to see again. And she thought, with the calm clarity of someone who has figured out a true thing, that she was entirely, irretrievably in love with this man. They sat at the kitchen table in the October light, holding hands, and said nothing for a while because nothing needed to be said, and this particular silence was the best one yet. The courtship, as they called it, was distinctive in that it happened between 2 people who were already living in the same house and working in the same space, and knew each other's particular rhythms and irritations. So it had to find its form in smaller, more deliberate things. Micah rode to Caldwell and returned with a small bunch of late autumn wildflowers that he set in a tin cup on the kitchen windowsill without comment. Anna made a peach pie from the last of the preserved peaches, because he had once mentioned, in passing, that peach pie was the thing he missed most about his mother's kitchen. He began saving the better stories from his days at the fence or with the cattle for supper, and she stopped pretending she wasn't paying equal attention to his face when she told him about her day. He asked about her childhood, and she told him things she'd told no one, the particular texture of her life before and after her father's drinking got bad, the way her mother had protected her, and the cost of that protection. He listened with the full weight of his attention and said when she was done that she was the strongest person he had ever known. "I'm not strong," she said. "I just keep going." "That's what strong is," he said. He told her about the tintype under his bed. Her name was Clara Langston, he said, and they had been sweethearts in Missouri, and he had intended to marry her, and she had married someone else when his parents died, and he went into his year of grief and silence. He said it plainly, without excessive pain. It was the past and it was finished, and he was telling her because he didn't want things in the house that she'd found and didn't understand. "I put everything back exactly where it was," she said. "I know," he said. "You're very thorough." "Are you over her?" she asked, because she was a clear person and she wanted things to be clear. "Thoroughly," he said. "Years ago." "Good," she said. "You're not going to ask for details." "No," she said. "You told me the relevant parts." He looked at her, fond and amused and something more than both. "You are an extraordinary woman," he said. "I know," she said, and the way she said it was half serious and half laughing, and he laughed too properly, and the kitchen was full of it. The first snow came in November, a modest one, 4 inches, and they woke to the prairie white and still and blue-shadowed in the early light. And Anna stood at the kitchen door with her coffee and looked at it, and Micah came up behind her and stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him and said, quietly, "First Kansas winter. How does it look to you?" "Beautiful," she said. "And cold." "Both true," he said. He was very close behind her, not touching but present, and she was aware of every inch of the space between them. She turned around, which put them very close together, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the distance between them closed in the way such distances close when two people stop managing them, and he kissed her. It was not dramatic, that first kiss. It was quiet and certain and warm, and it tasted of coffee and the particular care that had been building between them since June. And when it ended, she kept her eyes closed for a moment longer than necessary. And when she opened them, he was watching her face with an expression she would carry with her for the rest of her life, which was the expression of a man seeing something he had not dared hope for, looking exactly as real as it was. "I should tell you," she said, still close, "that I have written to my cousin Martha." "What did you tell her?" he asked. "That the situation," she said, "is no longer unclear." He smiled at that, the full warm smile, and kissed her again, and the snow fell outside in absolute silence, and the windmill turned, and the horses moved slowly in the corral, and the Bluewater kitchen was very warm. In December, Gerald Forsythe made one more appearance in their lives, the way bad memories sometimes do, suddenly and without invitation. He rode up the Bluewater Trail on a December afternoon with 2 men Anna didn't know, and a self-righteous expression that sat badly on his pink face. And he stood in the yard and called for Micah Walden with the particular tone of a man who thinks he has the law on his side. Micah came out of the barn and Anna came onto the porch, and Forsythe announced that he had a complaint to file with the county regarding the conditions of the auction contract, which he claimed gave him prior claim on Anna's contract since he had been the highest bidder at one point during the proceedings. It was a hollow legal argument built on spite, and both Micah and Anna knew it, but Micah crossed the yard and spoke to Forsythe in a low, even voice for about 3 minutes, and Anna couldn't hear most of it, but she heard Forsythe's voice rising and then dropping, and she saw the 2 men with Forsythe exchange a glance, and at the end of those 3 minutes Forsythe and his companions rode back down the trail without looking back. When Micah came up onto the porch, she said, "What did you say to him?" "I told him the legal position of his claim, which is non-existent," Micah said, "and I also told him that if he came onto this property again with that manner and that tone, he'd be leaving without the horse." She looked at him. "You wouldn't?" "No," he said, "but he believed I might." She laughed, and he looked so pleased at the sound of it that she laughed again. Forsythe was never heard from again. Christmas at Bluewater was the first Christmas Anna had celebrated since her mother's last one, 6 years prior, and she approached it with a kind of careful, provisional hope, the way you approach good things when you've been trained by experience to expect them to turn. She made a wreath from dried prairie grasses and berries she'd saved in the cellar, and Micah rode to Caldwell and came back with a small parcel that he wouldn't let her see until Christmas morning. They exchanged their gifts at the kitchen table with coffee and the particular Kansas winter light coming in the east window. He gave her a journal, bound in dark leather, with her initials pressed into the cover. She gave him a pair of gloves she had stitched from the finest leather she could get from the tanner in Caldwell, lined with the softest flannel she had, sized precisely to his hands because she had traced them one evening while he was asleep in his chair. When he saw the gloves, he put them on immediately and flexed his hands inside them and looked at her with that expression and said nothing for a moment. "The stitching on the thumb is a bit uneven," she said. "I was working from a pattern I made up." "Anna," he said. "What? Marry me." She looked at him. "Now, in the spring," he said, "or sooner, but yes, marry me." She looked at the journal in her lap with her initials on the cover. She looked at his hands in the gloves she'd made. She looked at his face, that particular Micah Walden face with its decided jaw and its warm brown eyes, and the evidence of 4 months of happiness living right there in the lines around his mouth. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his gloved hands and kissed her with the full force of everything he'd been holding carefully all these months, and she kissed him back with equal completeness, and the kitchen light fell across them both, and somewhere in the distance the windmill turned, and that was that. They married in February, not spring, because neither of them was inclined to wait longer than necessary once a decision had been made. The ceremony was held in the Caldwell church, a small frame building with warped pews and a minister named Reverend Coates who had married more frontier couples than he could count, and had therefore developed a ceremony that was honest and warm and finished in under 20 minutes, which suited both of them. Anna wore the green dress with the brass buttons and had her hair done properly for once with the help of Mrs. Cutter from the hotel, who had taken a decided interest in Anna's situation since the afternoon of the auction and had opinions about hair arrangements. There was a small gathering. The Caswell boys, Pete and Dan's wife Ruth, who was the closest thing to a female friend Anna had found in Caldwell, and Boone Aldrich from the AA who brought his wife Esther and a bottle of very good whiskey, and Mrs. Cutter herself, and old Seth who ran the hardware store and had once sold Micah a mule that turned out to be excellent, and felt that this created a bond between them. Reverend Coates asked the words and Micah said his without hesitation, and Anna said hers with her chin up and her eyes very green and clear, and when Reverend Coates said husband and wife, Micah held Anna's hands in both of his and looked at her and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "There she is." She understood what he meant. She understood that he was saying, "There is the person I was looking for, and I found her on a platform in June, and now here she is standing in my church in a green dress saying yes to everything ahead." She said, equally quiet, "Here you are." It was the most private public moment either of them had ever had, and it belonged entirely to the two of them. Boone Aldrich opened the whiskey in the churchyard, and there was an informal celebration in the February cold. Everyone bundled in their coats, and Anna found herself laughing at something Dan Caswell said, and then looking across the small crowd for Micah, because the habit of finding him with her eyes was already well established, and he was already looking back at her. And the warmth between them across that cold February churchyard was visible enough that Esther Aldrich leaned over to her husband and said something that made him grin. They rode home to Bluewater as husband and wife, side by side this time because Micah had brought a second horse for Anna to ride on occasion since October, a quiet bay mare she'd named Penny because of the copper color of her coat. The ride was 12 miles and the day was cold but clear, the kind of winter clarity that made the Kansas plains look like a painting of themselves, every grass blade and fence post and distant rise rendered in sharp light and blue shadow. "Are you warm enough?" Micah asked. "I have my coat," she said. "You have your coat," he agreed, and there was a quality in his voice, warm and layered, that made her smile all 12 miles home. The spring of 1880 came early and hard, the way Kansas springs sometimes did, with alternating days of bloom and late freeze that required constant vigilance over the kitchen garden and the new calves. Anna managed the household accounts and the garden, and took on the keeping of the ranch records, which she organized from Micah's scattered system of notes and receipts into a ledger that was a model of clarity. Micah looked at it the first time and said it was better than the records the Caldwell Bank kept, which may have been true. Ruth Caswell came out to Bluewater in April and spent a day helping Anna put up the first of the spring preserves, and they talked the way women talked when they were working side by side with their hands occupied and their minds free, and Ruth said, at some point in the afternoon, "I didn't think a bride auction could produce a decent marriage." "It didn't," Anna said, stirring the pot. "The auction produced a coat and a bid. The marriage is something else." Ruth laughed. "You love him very much." "Ferociously," Anna said, without hesitation, and the word surprised her when it came out, but it was completely accurate. That summer, Anna realized she was expecting their first child. She told Micah on a Tuesday evening after supper, sitting on the front porch in the long summer light with the prairie gold around them. She said it simply, the way she said most things, and watched his face. His face did something she had not quite seen before, something that moved through it in layers: surprise, then a kind of deep, private joy, then something that was almost overwhelmed, and he looked at her and reached out and took her hand with such deliberate, careful tenderness that she felt it all the way through. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling well," she said. "I've been feeling well for 3 weeks. I just wanted to be certain before I told you." 3 weeks, he said, with the expression of a man who has just learned he was the last to know something important and is finding it more charming than annoying. "I was certain," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles slowly and said against her hand, "Anna." "Yes. I am very happy," he said. It came out with a simplicity that was the truest kind of eloquent. "I know," she said. "I am too." The pregnancy altered the rhythm of Bluewater without disrupting it, because Anna was not a woman inclined to disruption. She continued her work, the accounts, the garden, the household, with the practical adjustment of someone who has encountered a new variable and is integrating it sensibly. She was healthy and capable, and in possession of strong opinions about what she could and couldn't do, and Micah learned the line between appropriate concern and unnecessary, hovering with a speed that spoke well of his intelligence. He brought Dr. Haverson out from Caldwell in September to confirm everything was proceeding properly, and Dr. Haverson, who was a small, precise man with spectacles and a very good reputation, confirmed that it was, and told Micah that his wife was in excellent health and that he was worrying more than the situation warranted. "He's not worried," Anna said, from the chair where she was sitting with her accounts. "He's being careful. There's a difference." Dr. Haverson looked between them and smiled the smile of a man who has seen many marriages and can tell the good ones at a glance. The baby came in January of 1881, in a snowstorm, because of course it did, because Anna Beckett Walden was constitutionally incapable of doing things the uncomplicated way, a quality her husband had come to find deeply endearing even when it caused him to ride through a blizzard at 3 in the morning to fetch the doctor from Caldwell. He was a boy. He had Micah's dark brows and Anna's green eyes, a combination that promised he would either be very handsome or very startling, and it turned out to be both. They named him James, after nobody in particular, because the name was solid and honest and fit him the way good things fit when they're right. Micah sat in the chair beside the bed where Anna lay with James, and he held his son with the same careful, purposeful steadiness he brought to everything, and his face was doing the overwhelmed thing again deeply more than before, and Anna watched him with the particular satiety of someone who has everything she needs. "He has your eyes," Micah said. "He has your frown," Anna said. "I don't frown." "You absolutely do. You're doing it right now." He looked up and the frown became the smile, the full, warm one, and he said, "I love you." With the same simplicity he'd said everything else true, and Anna said, "I know, I love you too." Ferociously, and James blinked his newborn eyes at the January light coming in the east window and seemed, in the manner of all newborns, entirely unconcerned with the magnitude of what was happening around him. The years at Bluewater built on each other the way good things build, steadily, without drama, each year adding something true to the year before. In 1882, they added a proper kitchen to the house, an extension with a larger stove, and a pantry that could actually hold the volume of Anna's preserving and baking, which had by this point become something of a local legend. Ruth Caswell's sister had married a man who ran a boarding house in Caldwell, and Anna supplied them with preserved fruits and pickles, and a particular spiced bread that the boarding house guests specifically requested, which became a modest but genuine source of income that Anna managed with the same precision she brought to everything. The ranch grew. Micah expanded the herd to 120 head by 1883 and hired a permanent hand, a steady Texan named Carmelo, who had come north with a cattle drive and decided he liked Kansas and would stay. Carmelo was quiet and competent and had a daughter in San Antonio he sent money to every month, and he ate supper at the Walden table 3 nights a week and was considered, by everyone who observed it, part of the family in every way that mattered. James learned to walk and then to run, and then to climb everything climbable, which kept Anna in a state of constant low-level watchfulness that she handled with equanimity, and Micah handled by building a fence around the well. James had his mother's opinions and his father's patience, which was an interesting combination in a 3-year-old, and promised to be formidable in an adult. In the spring of 1883, Anna told Micah she was expecting again. "Tuesday again," he said. "Thursday this time," she said. "Progress," he said. She threw a dish towel at him and he caught it and grinned. The second child was a girl, born in autumn when the prairie was gold and red and the air smelled of coming winter. They named her Clara, which surprised no one more than Micah, but Anna had found the name in the back of her mind one evening and turned it over and decided that names belonged to people who used them well, and she intended to raise a girl who would, and so Clara it was. When he heard the name, he looked at her with a complexity of expression she read exactly, the past and the present occupying the same moment gently, without conflict. "Are you certain?" he said. "I'm always certain," she said. "You know that." He kissed her forehead and looked at his daughter and said quietly that it was a good name and she could see him settling something, releasing something, and when he looked back up his face was just his face, present and clear. Clara had red gold hair, which surprised everybody since neither parent was particularly red, and she had a laugh that started in her whole body and worked its way out. And James, who had initially been skeptical about the entire project, fell entirely in love with her within the first week, and would spend the following years managing her safety with the same low-key intensity his father brought to everything. Anna wrote to her cousin Martha in Abilene with the news, as she had written with each significant development since 1879, and Martha wrote back with the warmth she always brought to the correspondence, and the assurance that she would visit in the spring, a promise she had made 4 times and which Anna still held with optimism. Martha visited in the spring of 1884, and it was the first time Anna had seen her since Abilene in 1879, and they sat at the kitchen table with coffee, while the children played in the yard and Micah moved somewhere in the background of the ranch doing useful things, and Martha looked around the Bluewater kitchen with its clean yellow curtains that Anna had made from the last of the green fabric remnants, with the herbs hanging from the ceiling beam and the well-organized pantry and the ledger open on the side table and James's boots by the door and Clara's wooden horse on the windowsill, and Martha said, "You are very happy." "Yes," Anna said. "It doesn't look like I imagined," Martha said, "when I got your first letter, the one that said the situation was unclear." "No," Anna said, "it looks better." Martha was watching Micah through the window where he was mending a fence rail in the morning light, and James had appeared beside him and was being shown how to hold the hammer. "He's a good man," Martha said. "He's the best man I know," Anna said simply, and meant it without drama as a statement of fact. That evening, after Martha had been put in the guest room, they had added a 5th room to the house in 1882, and the children were asleep. Anna and Micah sat on the front porch in the spring dark with the prairie breathing around them and the stars doing what Kansas stars did, which was absolutely everything. "Martha likes you," Anna said. "I'm glad," he said. She was skeptical at first, Anna said. When she got my letters, she thought the whole arrangement sounded questionable. It was questionable, Micah said. Reasonably so, Anna agreed. But it worked out. He put his arm around her and she settled against him, and the porch was warm despite the spring evening chill because he always ran warm and she had long since claimed this as a personal resource. The windmill turned. The horses moved in the corral. Clara made a small sound in her sleep through the open window and then settled. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "Which part?" "Any of it, the platform, the coat, the 10 minutes you asked for." "Often," he said. "What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment, the considering quiet. "I think I would have been an entirely different man if I'd walked past that crowd," he said. "Not worse necessarily, but different. Less." He paused. "Less full of something that matters." She tilted her head up and looked at his profile in the dark, the decided jaw, the particular set of his mouth, and she thought about all the ways the world could have arranged itself differently. If she had never come to Caldwell or come and not been taken to the auction. If he had come to town on a different day or arrived after the hammer came down. If he had been a man who kept walking. "You put your coat on me," she said, "before you knew anything about me." "Yes," he said. "Why, really, the real answer, not the careful one." He turned to look at her, and in the dark his eyes held whatever light there was, the way eyes do when they belong to someone who is fully present. "Because you were a person standing in the cold," he said, "and I had a coat." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most Micah Walden answer you've ever given me." "Is that good?" he said. "Micah," she said, and reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and his eyes went soft and warm the way they always did when she touched him like that. "It is the best answer I have ever heard." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and the night was enormous and full of stars, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the silence was the best one yet, the way it always was, always the best one yet, because they kept building on it. The years continued their honest work. By 1886, the Blue Water Ranch was a genuine operation. 160 acres fully worked with a herd that Micah and Carmelo managed with practiced efficiency. The house had grown into something that looked, from the road, like exactly what it was, a place where people lived well and purposefully. Anna's kitchen garden had expanded to a proper acre, and she had developed a particular talent for dry farming techniques suited to the Kansas climate that she had read about in agricultural journals Micah brought from Caldwell, and she'd shared what she learned with 3 neighboring farm wives, which spread gradually through the community in the quiet, consequential way practical knowledge moves when women share it. James was 5, and he had opinions about everything and the patience to express them clearly, which his teacher at the new Caldwell school, a firm young woman named Miss Earlywood, found alternately impressive and testing. Clara was 3, and she had developed a comprehensive relationship with the ranch's barn cat, a large orange creature named Commodore, who suffered her attentions with feline forbearance. The 2 children were constants in the texture of Blue Water life, their voices and their boots on the porch and their particular needs shaping every day around something warm and irreversible. Micah had developed a slight formality with James that was the particular formality of a man who loves fiercely and is not entirely sure how to encompass it. He was careful with his son, attentive, unhurried in the way he taught him things, and James looked at his father with the clear-eyed devotion of a child who knows instinctively that he is entirely safe. With Clara he was less formal. Something in her personality had undone whatever reserve he maintained, and he had been observed by Anna on multiple occasions sitting in the yard with a 3-year-old and a barn cat doing something that could only be described as playing pretend, with a seriousness of expression that was entirely at odds with the activity. Anna had never loved him more than in those moments. She ran a practical household and a warm one. The accounts were immaculate, the pantry was full, the kitchen table had seen more meals and conversations and moments of consequence than any furniture had a right to see. She was known in the community around Caldwell as a woman of good sense and direct manner, which was not always the most comfortable reputation for a woman to have in 1886. But Micah had never, not once, given her reason to be anything other than exactly herself, and so she remained it. He had, over the years, developed certain habits that she found endearing, though she never said so directly. He left the better of the two lanterns on her side when she was reading. He remembered without being reminded the names of everyone she mentioned in passing and asked after them specifically in later conversations. He kept the woodpile twice as full as it needed to be because she had once mentioned, in the first winter, that running out of wood was among her deepest practical fears. She had developed certain habits too. She made the particular spiced cornbread on days when the cattle work was hard, because he never asked for anything specific, but once, in passing, he'd mentioned it was his mother's recipe. She kept the ledger so clearly that he could find any figure in 30 seconds, because his mind worked that way, in numbers and lines. She watched the sky with him on evenings when weather was building, standing on the porch together with the wind coming, because she knew he liked company in that watching. These were small things. They were the substance of a life. In the autumn of 1887, something happened that neither of them had anticipated, though perhaps they should have. The packing house in Wichita sent a letter with an offer, a long-term supply contract at a guaranteed price, the kind of stability that a rancher in the Kansas Territory would have been foolish to decline. The offer was substantial enough that Micah sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the ledger and a pen for 2 hours, working through the numbers with the particular intensity he brought to large decisions. Anna came and looked over his shoulder at the figures and said, "Take it." He looked up. "You haven't seen all the terms." "I've seen enough," she said. "And I've seen your face while you've been reading, and your face says take it." He put the pen down and looked at her. "When did you learn to read my face?" "June of 1879, she said. "On a platform." He laughed, that honest, full-throated laugh that still surprised him sometimes when it came. He took the contract. The winter of 1887 was the hard one, the one that would be remembered across the Kansas Territory for years, starting in November and coming down with the particular ferocity of a season that has something to prove. The temperature dropped and stayed, the kind of cold that cracked wood and froze wells and required a relentlessness of maintenance just to keep animals and people alive. Micah and Carmelo worked the cattle through it with the grim persistence of experienced cattlemen who understand that there is no negotiating with weather, only enduring it. Anna kept the house, managed the fuel, kept an account of supplies with the precision of a quartermaster, and made an enormous volume of hot food that sustained everyone through the worst of it. There were 3 nights in February when it was too dangerous to sleep, when the temperature dropped below what the house's insulation could manage and the wind found ways in through the frame construction, and they all gathered in the main room with every blanket in the house and the fireplace burning through the night, Micah and Carmelo taking turns feeding it, the children sleeping in a nest of quilts with the barn cat Commodore, who had been upgraded to indoor status for the duration of the crisis. On the second of those 3 nights, when the children were asleep and Carmelo was dozing in the corner chair, Anna and Micah sat together in front of the fire, and she was within the circle of his arm and his chin was resting against her hair, and the fire was the only moving thing in a frozen world. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "No," she said. "Are you?" "A little," he said honestly, "for the herd. Carmelo says the horses are all right." "The horses are all right," he agreed. "It's the cattle I'm watching." She put her hand over his where it rested on her arm. "We'll manage," she said. "We always do," he said. "Yes," she said, "we always do." They lost 11 head of cattle in the February cold, which was bad but not catastrophic. And by March the worst was over and the prairie began its slow return to itself. and the losses were absorbed into the year's accounts with the pragmatic acceptance of people who have chosen to live in a landscape that does not make promises. Micah spent April repairing everything the winter had damaged, which was considerable, and Anna planted the spring garden later than usual because the ground took its time thawing, and James helped her in the rows with the focused seriousness of a 6-year-old who has decided that farming is his primary intellectual interest, which would prove to be true for approximately 4 more months before horses overtook it. Clara, who was 4, found a bird with a broken wing somewhere in the yard and brought it to her father with the full certainty that he would be able to fix it. Micah sat in the yard and listened to a detailed explanation from Clara about the bird's name, which was apparently William, and the circumstances of its discovery, and then he very carefully examined the wing and showed Clara how to make a small splint from a stick and a strip of cloth, and they set William in a box in the barn with water and grain, and William recovered over the following 2 weeks with a level of veterinary attention that Carmelo found extremely impressive. When William flew away in May, Clara stood in the yard and watched him go with an expression of complicated pride, and Micah stood beside her and watched too and said, "He'll be all right." And Clara said, "I know, Papa," with the certainty of a child who has been taught, in many small ways, that things tend to work out when you care for them properly. The summer of 1888 arrived with the particular Kansas lushness of a good water year, the grass running long and green, and the creek at Bluewater running high, and the garden exceeded even Anna's expectations, which were not modest. She had 3 bushels of tomatoes and a quantity of squash that tested the capacity of the root cellar, and she and Ruth Caswell, who came out 2 days running, put up preserves in a volume that would last both families through the following winter, and then some. Micah watched the operation from a careful distance and provided logistics, which was to say he moved heavy things when asked and stayed out of the kitchen when not invited, which was the wisdom of experience. On the second day, when Ruth had gone home and Anna was finishing the last of the ceiling, he brought her a glass of cold water from the pump and set it on the table beside her and kissed the back of her neck and said, "The cellar is going to be magnificent." "It already is," she said, not looking up from the jar she was sealing. He put his hands on her shoulders and pressed his thumbs gently along her spine, because she had been bent over the stove for 2 days and he knew exactly where she was aching, and she made a small sound of grateful relief and kept working, and he kept his hands where they were. "Micah," she said. "Yes." "Thank you for learning where I hurt," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Thank you for trusting me enough to notice," he said. She set down the jar and turned around inside his arms and looked up at him, and 9 years of Bluewater were in her face, 9 years of working and building and weathering hard winters and laughing in the kitchen and reading by the lamp and watching storms from the porch and being entirely, completely known by another person. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said, the way she had once said "I know" when he'd told her she was the strongest person he knew, with the full weight of genuine comprehension. "I love you too, ferociously." She smiled at that. It was still her word and she was glad he'd borrowed it. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." In the fall of 1888 she discovered she was expecting their 3rd child and told him on a Tuesday, which made him look at her with patient, amused certainty. "All right," he said, "Tuesday." "I was going to wait for Thursday," she said, "but it seemed unfair." This baby arrived in early spring of 1889, a boy again, with his mother's auburn hair and a vocal quality that announced itself to the entire household from his first moment. They named him Thomas, and James received him with the gravity of an 8-year-old who understands that his role has officially expanded, and Clara received him with the efficient enthusiasm of a 5-year-old who has previous experience with things that need tending. Carmelo, who was invited to see the baby with the casualness of long family inclusion, held Thomas with the careful propriety of a man who knows how, and said that he was the finest baby he had seen in Kansas, which was diplomatic, and that his lungs were something extraordinary, which was simply accurate. The family of Bluewater was now 5, which filled the house in the ways houses are meant to be filled, with noise and purpose and the complicated daily texture of people who belong to each other. By 1890, Caldwell had grown considerably, and its rough frontier qualities had begun their slow civilization: more frame buildings, a proper school, a church that could seat 100, a law office that had seen actual use. The cattle trail culture was changing as the railroads pushed further west and the great drives became less necessary, and ranchers like Micah were adapting, looking more to regional supply and direct contracts than to the long trail to the north. Micah sat with Anna one Sunday evening and laid out the situation in the clear, unhurried way he laid out all problems. The Wichita contract was solid, he said, but the market was shifting, and they needed to think about the next 10 years differently from how they'd thought about the last 10. Anna had been considering the same thing. She had the ledger out and several figures underlined. She had also, without telling him, written 3 letters to agricultural extension offices asking about diversification strategies for the southern Kansas region. He looked at her letters when she brought them out and shook his head slowly, with a smile working at the corner of his mouth. "You wrote those before I started talking," he said. "A month ago," she said. "Anna," he said. "Yes. I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "What do you think about oats and wheat as a secondary crop?" He laughed and leaned over the ledger, and they spent 2 hours working through it together, side by side at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the children asleep and the Bluewater night enormous around them. They planted their first wheat field in the spring of 1890, 30 acres on the south quarter where the soil ran deep and the water table was reliable. It was experimental, Micah said, a hedge against the shifting cattle market. Anna said it was also beautiful, which he acknowledged was true, that 30 acres of young wheat in the May light was not an ugly thing. The wheat came in well enough the first year to justify the second year, and by 1892 the Bluewater operation was running cattle and grain in a balance that proved, across the variable Kansas years, more stable than either alone. Carmelo had brought on his nephew Rodrigo from Texas as a second hand, and Rodrigo had opinions about horses that impressed Micah and made James, who was 11 and deep in his horse phase, extremely happy. Anna ran the household and the accounts and the kitchen garden and her preserving business and her correspondence with agricultural offices and her writing, because she had begun, in the evenings, to write. She wrote about the ranch and about the land and about the particular quality of Plains life as she had come to know it, and she wrote in the journal Micah had given her on their first Christmas, and when she filled it she bought another, and she filled those too. She did not know, in 1892, that some of what she wrote would eventually find its way, through a circuitous route involving her cousin Martha and a publishing office in Kansas City, to print. That was further ahead than either of them was looking. In 1892, she was simply writing because the words wanted to be there, and Micah read them when she let him, which was sometimes, and looked at her after with the particular expression that she had collected over the years and kept carefully, the one that said he found her remarkable and had no intention of diminishing it with excessive comment. The children grew, as children do, in their own directions. James apprenticed himself to the cattle work from the age of 12, with the focused certainty of someone who has found his purpose. Clara, who had been artistic since she could hold a pencil, showed a talent for drawing that Anna nurtured with paper and good pencils, and Clara drew everything: the horses, the windmill, the kitchen garden, Commodore the barn cat growing old and rotund, the particular way the light fell across the prairie in the late afternoon. Thomas was their wild card, gregarious and inventive in ways that neither of his parents were quite, interested in everything, and committed to nothing for more than 3 weeks at a time, which drove James to distraction and delighted Clara. In the evenings, in the years when the children were growing into themselves and the ranch was running with the confidence of a well-built thing, Anna and Micah found their time together in the hours after everyone else was asleep. They were on the porch more nights than not, with the seasons changing around them, watching the Kansas sky do what it did, which was everything at all times, with no restraint. "Do you ever miss anything?" He asked her one autumn evening in 1893, the kind of idle question that wasn't actually idle. "From before," she said. "From anywhere," she thought about it. "I miss my mother," she said. "The same way I've always missed her. That doesn't change." She considered, "And I miss the sea, but I've never seen the sea, so what I miss is the idea of it." "We could go someday," he said. "The children are old enough." She looked at him. "Galveston is 800 miles. 800 miles is manageable," he said. "Micah Walden," she said. "What? Are you suggesting a family trip to the Gulf of Mexico?" "I'm floating the idea," he said. She turned to look at the prairie and the stars, and she thought about this extraordinary life that had come out of a terrible afternoon on a platform in June, about the coat that had been placed around her shoulders by a man she didn't know who had simply thought she deserved it, about the 10 minutes that became everything. "Next summer," she said, "after the wheat comes in." He reached over and took her hand. "Next summer," he agreed. They made the trip in the summer of 1894. All 5 of them plus Carmelo, who had never seen the ocean either, and who Micah refused to leave behind out of a principled position, that good people should see the things they wanted to see. It was a journey of considerable logistics, and James managed most of the packing with the serious efficiency he had inherited from his mother. And Clara drew the landscape all the way down through Indian Territory and into Texas. And Thomas made friends with 3 separate strangers on the train and had to be collected twice. They stood on the beach at Galveston in July, the Kansas family, looking at the Gulf of Mexico, which was green-blue and enormous and smelled of salt and distance, and the waves came in steady and rhythmic across the sand. And Anna Beckett Walden stood with her shoes in her hand and her feet in the warm water and the wind taking her hair entirely apart, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Micah stood beside her, his boots off as well, his feet in the water, and he watched her face. "Is it what you imagined?" he said. "No," she said. "It's better." She looked at him and he looked back, and 15 years were in both their faces. 15 years of building something true from an unpromising afternoon. 15 years of a man who had put his coat on her before he bid and then made good on everything the gesture promised. "Micah," she said. "Yes." "Do you remember what you said on the platform? You said you'd take it from here." He smiled. "I remember." "You have," she said. "You have taken it from there every day." He put his arm around her, and the Gulf of Mexico moved in its ancient, enormous way around their feet, and behind them James was attempting to teach Thomas how to skip stones over the waves, which was not quite how stone skipping worked. And Clara sat in the sand drawing the horizon line with the concentration of someone trying to get an infinite thing right. And Carmelo stood a little apart, looking at the water with an expression of pure, private joy. Anna leaned into Micah and he held her, and the waves came in, and the summer light was on everything. They went home to Bluewater in August, back to the familiar shape of the ranch and the prairie and the Kansas sky. And Anna planted the fall garden, and Micah tallied the wheat yield, and James helped Rodrigo with the herd. And Clara had filled an entire new sketchbook with drawings from the Gulf Coast, and Thomas had decided he wanted to be a sailor for approximately 6 days, and then wanted to be a doctor, which lasted considerably longer. The years after were good years, the kind of years that are the reward for the hard ones, full of the honest work and the ordinary pleasures and the particular richness of a life where people know and are known by each other. James took on more of the ranch management as Micah let himself, without quite admitting he was doing it, stepped back and let his son grow into the operation. Clara went to study at a school for young women in Kansas City in 1897, and her letters home were illustrated in the margins with drawings of the city and its people, and Anna kept every one. Thomas, true to his nature, went in 3 directions simultaneously. He helped with the ranch, studied medicine through correspondence, and read everything he could find. Anna's writing found its audience in the quiet way it had been building toward. A piece she sent to a Kansas agricultural journal on dry farming techniques was reprinted by 2 other journals. A longer essay about ranch life on the southern plains found its way to an editor in Kansas City who wrote her a letter asking if she had more. She had more. The exchange of letters led, by 1898, to a modest collection of essays published under her name that was read by farm families across the Plains states and received with the warmth of recognition. This was their life, made visible. Micah held the book in his hands the day it arrived and turned it over and read her name on the cover and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, which was astonishment and pride so complete they were nearly the same thing. "Anna Beckett Walden," he said. "Yes," she said, "you wrote a book." "I wrote several things and someone put them in a book," she said. "You are remarkable," he said. "You've mentioned that," she said, "once or twice." "I'll mention it again," he said, "for the next 40 years. She looked at him, this man who had not changed in the essential ways, who was still the man who had walked across a platform and laid a coat on her shoulders before he did a single thing else, who still listened with his whole face and said true things without decoration and loved her ferociously, and had been, since June of 1879, the organizing fact of everything good in her life. "Deal," she said. The fall of 1900 brought a celebration of sorts that none of them had planned. It was simply a Sunday in October, the kind of perfect plains day where the light is gold and the air is clean, and you can see 30 miles in every direction, and the whole household was in the yard for no particular reason. James at 20 talking to Rodrigo about the spring purchases, Clara home from Kansas City for a visit drawing the barn with autumn light on it, Thomas demonstrating something from his medical texts to Carmelo, who had the patient expression of a man who agrees to anything, Micah fixing a gate hinge with the deliberate precision he brought to all small repairs. Anna stood on the porch and watched all of it. She had a cup of coffee and the morning sun and the prairie running out in all directions, gold and red in its October colors, and the windmill turning steadily, and the horses in the corral, and her family in the yard, and the book inside on the kitchen shelf with her name on the spine, and 21 years of blue water behind her, and the clear expectation of many more ahead. She thought about a burlap sack and a platform in June. She thought about standing in thin blue cotton in the afternoon sun, trying to hold herself together with sheer stubbornness, and the particular sound of footsteps crossing the boards behind her, and the warmth of a coat settling around her shoulders, and the moment she turned and saw a man who looked at her face instead of her dress. She thought about 10 minutes in a hotel parlor and 12 miles behind a man on a steady sorrel horse and beans and salt pork and a kitchen that became hers, and Tuesday evenings and borrowed words, and a green dress with brass buttons and storms watched from a narrow porch, and a proposal on Christmas morning, and a February wedding and January babies, and all the long, ordinary, wonderful years of a life built between 2 people who chose each other and kept choosing, morning after morning. Micah looked up from the gate hinge and found her on the porch, the way he always found her with his eyes, the habit of 21 years. He straightened and looked at her across the yard with his hands on the gate and the morning light behind him, and she raised her coffee cup slightly, and he smiled, the full warm one, the one that had rearranged his face the first time she saw it and had never stopped. He walked across the yard and up the porch steps and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and both their faces held everything. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He took the coffee cup from her hand and drank from it and gave it back, which was a liberty he had been taking since approximately 1882 and which she had never objected to, and he said, "What are you thinking about?" "June," she said. "1879. He was quiet a moment, looking out at the yard where their children and their people were moving in the morning light, and then he looked at her. "Me too," he said. She put her free hand against his chest, over his heart, the way she did when she wanted him to simply be present and not say anything, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood on the Blue Water porch in October of 1900 and looked at everything they'd made together, which was considerable and honest and entirely theirs. The windmill turned. The prairie ran out in all directions. The sun was warm. It was, by any measure that mattered, exactly enough, and it was exactly more than enough, and it was going to keep being so for a very long time to come. Somewhere in the yard, Thomas said something that made Clara laugh, a laugh that started in her whole body the way it always had, and James shook his head with the long-suffering patience of an eldest child, and Carmelo smiled at the sky, and the morning opened itself out over Blue Water like a hand, generous and wide, holding everything gently, letting nothing go.